Hi, everyone. This is Craig Zelzer from PCDN, back for another live episode of the Social Change Career Podcast. It's season 11, episode 10. Woohoo. We're going to be talking to Alison Guzman today on building a career at the crossroads of Indigenous economics and social impact. Alison is the co-director of Maple Microdevelopment. She's based in Chile in Latin America. I'm based in Medellin, Colombia, so go Latin America today. She holds a master's degree in ethics and global affairs, indigenous rights from the American University in DC. She also holds a bachelor's degree in international studies and multi-ethnic studies also from AU, and museum studies at the Institute of American Indian Arts in New Mexico. My brother lives in Albuquerque. Big fan of New Mexico. She's, again, based in Chile for the past 10 years and has worked alongside Mapuche communities to co-design strategies for sustainability and is learning their language, Mapudungun. Let me know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. How do you pronounce it correctly?
Mapudungun, yeah.
Mapudungun. She also speaks Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Guarani. And for people who have not joined us before, we live stream this on LinkedIn and YouTube, and we really like to make this as engaging as possible. So as we're getting started and throughout the session, please let us know where you're watching from. Feel free, particularly in LinkedIn comments, to add a sentence or two about your interest, your background, what country or city you're based in. And throughout the entire session, we particularly welcome your questions and comments to make this as engaging as possible. And then usually within a few days, it should be by Friday this week, this will be up as one of 100, almost 20 episodes of the Social Change Career Podcast. You can find it on all major podcasting platforms and PCDN. Featuring brilliant innovators from all over the world, probably 30 countries, from sectors ranging from impact investing to humanitarian engineering to reducing gender-based violence to ag tech. So it's really, and you can search by topic or by region. So and then the two requests: if you like the episode or if you don't, please consider rating it, sharing it. Please follow PCDN and to stay attuned to what we're offering, and also please connect or follow Alison on LinkedIn and also Maple Microdevelopment, the website. So welcome everyone, and Alison, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to share your wisdom and experience and questions. And just to start off with, can you describe a little bit about how in the world did you go from, let's say, working on or engaging in all sorts of interesting around identity and kind of communities in the US, like how did you wind up in Chile? And what were you doing in the U.S., both in terms of your studies and the questions and issues you were trying to engage with, and how did that wind up then pivoting to Chile?
Welcome to my life. Thank you so much, Greg. Yeah, that's a question. That's the $1 million question. I'm still trying to respond to myself. No, well, I grew up actually overseas. I had the privilege to, because of the work that my parents did, I was able to, travel from one country to the other. So I actually was born in Austin, in Texas. But from there, I ended up as a baby being whisked to Puno, Peru, and then from there to El Salvador. I lived in Africa 8 years. So from the beginning, I was always in the constant move. Also, my father met my mother when he was a Peace Corps volunteer in Paraguay. So, my mom has her family in Paraguay, and I was able to visit my mom's family every other summer and be linked to that part of my heritage as well. In Paraguay. So I think from the beginning, I was just very well aware of the diversity as a society that we all are, and the cultures that are needing to, be free and revitalize themselves over the different pockets around the world. So that it's, that's how I see that's how I saw my vision, I guess, as a young woman, was this tapestry of places and cultures and languages and colors. So naturally, I wanted to continue in that direction, and which is why I embarked in the international studies, the School of International Service at American University, where I wanted to keep, learning about the diversity that we are as a planet, but also how I can contribute. And during that time, during my master's program, indeed, there was the conversation happening in New York around the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I remember attending and participating as an observer, as a young woman, first kind of learning. And I felt that this was really the place where I wanted to be. And I felt like, if anything, solutions are going to stem from the communities who are still in touch with their land-based practices and wisdom. So that's how I decided to make the commitment to contribute to the cause of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous movements. And it was difficult for me actually to get involved in the beginning. In fact, I worked after I graduated, I was working in around access to finance and as an analysis or like an analytical assistant, I guess, with the IFC in their work with extractive industries and communities as well. So I was kind of learning a broader scope around, how communities are being impacted by big, powerful negotiators and decision makers. So, and it was during the time when I was working for the IFC in Trinidad and Tobago that a big earthquake hit the region, and I learned of the sinister around decision making on catastrophes and chaos. And basically taking advantage of catastrophes and chaos. So at that time, I realized, well, I don't think this was for me. And I found Maple Microdevelopment, which was a small nonprofit that was founded by a group of business students at the University of Oregon, and embarked on this journey with them. Little did I know that I was going to be continuing my career with this nonprofit for forever. I mean, I'm still in it, and I really feel like we are a family today. So this nonprofit indeed started work in Uganda around savings issues, basically contesting what the broader development and microdevelopment or development and microfinance sectors, and kind of critiquing that. So that's how Maple began in Uganda, and then and it was then that I realized, well, why don't we do something in Latin America? And an opportunity arose where we were invited by an indigenous communities in 2013 to start kind of like a co-design with them on a Mapuche-led savings institution. So that's kind of where I am today. It was an invitation back in 2013 to me and my partner. We form a team, Ignacio Krell, and we decided that, okay, let's just do this. It's going to be a 6 months research project, and then from there we'll see where it goes. And here we are 10 years later. Working alongside indigenous peoples of the Mapuche territory of southern Chile.
Thank you so much. And just to welcome a few people, for some reason, some comments aren't showing up in our stream, but I'll just welcome. So welcome John from Kenya, Mustafa, I think from South Africa, Brainy from Uganda, Duali from Geneva, Craig, best name in the world, from Netherlands. Craig is an Atlantic Fellows, part of the Atlantic Fellows for Economic and Social Inequality. They do recruit them, advertise on PCM, check them out. The deadline's in a couple of months, one of the world's top fellowships. And I'm probably missing some other people. Please keep letting us know where you're watching from, put your questions and comments. So Alison, thanks for the amazing kind of story, background, and, kind of how you were, let's say, working inside the system, and you're still in the system, but obviously trying to explore alternatives. So a couple of questions. A lot of younger professionals aspire to work for multilaterals, whether it's IFC, the World Bank, OSCE, UN. And I'm not asking you to critique any, but like, what is for people who are thinking about whether, International Finance Corporation, World Bank, or any of these, whether it's finance or development, what are some of the skills that when you started, that you think are required either then or now? And what are some of the pros and cons for people who might want to go into multilaterals? And I think the nature of careers is radical. I have plenty of friends, all different multilaterals, but I think the nature of careers has really changed. So, some people will do 30 years at an institution, but obviously it's increasingly common. Someone might do, if you become a staff person, that's one thing, but often a consultant for a couple of years and move somewhere else. So, but just like your thoughts on the pros and cons of multilaterals, both in terms of skills and at least being part of one's career.
That's a great question. I think that I think what's important before entering into a multilateral career, to say the least, I guess, is to really understand what your commitment and what your responsibilities you feel as a person should be or is. I think that what really helped me from the get-go was to understand, like I said, in the introduction, in that great question, Craig, that even before I stepped into the IFC or interning for project managers, project management funded by USAID, for example, I was from the beginning committed to the cause of Indigenous people. So that to me was a setting stone. It was almost like a intentionality that I carried with me, and I still do. And I think that's important because the world is, and I'm talking here 20 years later, like I don't know how old I am, but yeah, a good chunk of time has passed, and life is changing, dynamics are changing, or things are shifting so quickly that the role of the multilateral entities are also in themselves not catching up to the needs of the planet. They're quite slow in terms of not only decision making, at least in my perspective, obviously, but in being able to swiftly address urgent needs of communities and wetlands and forests and bio homes and everything. I mean, these are big, large bureaucratic institutions that require paper to make decisions. So I guess a first thing I would recommend is to keep that in mind as you enter into in that world, to really understand your contribution or what your responsibility you feel as a person. And that way, any shifts in your career will always have some kind of source of intentionality, because otherwise, I feel in my own perspective and also soul searching, the concept of wealth is also changing these days. Sure, there is this need to have this very profit-oriented life. Income generation is important, as we all know, because we have bills to pay. But at the same time, how do we see wealth? Maybe it's not so much about accumulation, but of well-being and of understanding, how to create community in our own homes and our own lives around us. So I think that it's good reflection to understand also why you're coming into a career around this multilateral institutions, heavily bureaucratic, heavily designed to foster relationships between transnational companies and governments. I mean, you name it. So it's always good just to keep yourself and your soul kind of intact and preserved. I guess maybe I'm just speaking from a biased perspective. I don't know. I mean, I met really interesting people, really interesting initiatives, but indeed, I quickly learned that when the goals are not community led, it definitely creates you end up needing to leverage your own kind of ethics and your own moral dilemmas along the way. I don't know if that made sense, but who are you serving, I guess would be the question. Yeah.
Okay. Wonderful. Welcome, Barbara Moser Mercer. So Barbara and I collaborated for years, and she'll be on our podcast end of November. She's one of the world's experts on increasing access to higher education for refugees. So it'll be an amazing episode. And Alexandra Anda from Ecuador, so more people from Latin America. Please keep the questions and comments going. And I think that's really one of the essential thing is like, it's a, who are you serving and also who are you accountable to? Because I think in development speak, there's a lot of talk about who are the beneficiaries or the communities, but then where does that accountability go? And I'm on the advisory board of CDA Collaborative Development Associates, and they've been around 25 years, I think, doing some of the best work on thinking about accountability in the humanitarian peace building sphere and putting local voices and experiences at the center. But a lot of the bureaucracy and the systems, it's often like the ideas that are implemented often are good ideas, but they become so bureaucratized and watered down that the accountability often winds up being towards, the places that are providing the funding more than the communities that are, let's say, implementing. Or I think that's one of the most critical things in it. At least in my own experience, it is challenging. Like, I think being clear in ethics is important, but it's also challenging to find that right balance sometimes between paying the bills and ethics. Not always. Sometimes it's very easy. So going to a less challenging question. So when you think back to all your training, both professionally and on your own, and the work you've done over the past 15 years, what skills do you think are the most useful that you developed through academic training? What did you just learn by doing? What else did you do in upskilling? And for people who want to work, it depends how you call your work. So is it participatory economics? Is it indigenous rights? Is it decolonization? Like, do you call your work within a particular framework? But what are the skills that people might need who want to work at this intersection of, again, how do you define your work? So is it sustainability? Is it rights? Is it economics? Like, what would you call what you do?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I can start from where I began and then kind of where I'm at now and what I'm hoping to learn more in the future. So what began as this very, I guess my education involved Indigenous rights from a global perspective through academia at American University. And that's when I first learned of the need to critique current decision-making mechanisms that are in place at the global level. So indeed, this whole concept of the multilateral organizations, my program at AU invited me to explore alternatives and to question some of these approaches, the origins. I was introduced to decolonization, feminism. So indeed that opened me up to a whole world. And so I had this very broad vision of international and ethics and global issues, indigenous rights. And it was after I graduated that I started entering more into project management. So that got me involved into more the understanding of the mechanisms of how international development works and the relationship that funding and sources of development have to communities. So I started learning and practice as an intern, and then finally stepping into the IFC and how the works around the streamlining of decision making and financing, basically of I guess of agendas that are being put in place within that specific landscape or territory. And so that project management skill took me through to Maple, where I'm at today. This was probably like 15 years ago, though, in the sense that I learned a lot about the need to measure impact and what does impact actually mean from the community's perspective. So I began my work with Maple interacting with the community members and our leaders and the director of the Maple branch in Uganda to learn more about impact and what that means from the monitoring evaluation scheme, and that brought me to a skill that I was able to implement in our work here with the Mapuche communities in southern Chile. What is impact from their perspective, and what does it mean to design an economic alternative, or how do you co-design autonomous functions of economic sustainability and well-being and livelihoods. So I guess I would call myself along that perspective as indigenous-led economic co-designer. I don't have an actual label, I guess, for what I would call myself in that regard. But I do consider myself an ally, whether it's an ally participant, an ally researcher, an ally co-designer, and that's how I still see myself. And in this process, and in this trajectory where I'm at right now, is I'm at the cross point of understanding philanthropy, and that's what I've been exploring the last couple of years. And actually, before I go there, I did want to say that my introduction and what I did with the museum studies at the Institute of American Indian Arts, which I did a 2-year online program a couple of years ago, was a program that enabled me to learn more of specific technical tools. In this case, in museums, right? But because it was within an indigenous-led context, I was able to use those tools and apply it to my work with the Mapuche communities. And that gave me some concrete kind of attributes. So I wasn't just in my head. I was able to contribute through software, through archives, through methodologies, through tools and toolkits with my community counterparts and community partners. And that actually, I give a lot of credit to the museum field at the Institute of American Indian Arts. And I do think that it's worth exploring these tools that are centered around common spaces like libraries and museums. I don't know if there's any other spaces like those, but it really gives you an insight into what it means to manage from the perspective of the commons, I guess, and from the perspective of culture and heritage. So in that case, I was able to bring that into my work with the Mapuche communities around archives, archiving knowledge, and working in this consistent effort of well-being with the communities, or in the sense of self-determination and autonomous economic function. So where I'm at now, indeed, is understanding that these practices and these impacts were not done all on our own. We actually did need and receive support from funders, from other groups that are also working with the indigenous cause, and so our colleagues, our Mapuche colleagues, are receiving and also getting the attention of these efforts today. So philanthropy is a big part of this whole network. So I guess, thinking of your question, I would see answers in various stages of my life, Craig. I don't see it as, I think in every stage, there was always a different kind of framework of how I perceive myself. And I see today that philanthropy and creating networks and relationship building is ever more important, because we're realizing that some of the networks that have been in place in power for decades, if not centuries, are disintegrating because they're losing their credibility, because we are in a time of the planet that drastic change needs to happen. And so what better way to create alternatives than to link with other like-minded individuals who are also creating solutions for, pro territory and earth coexisting with the earth, I guess, to put it that way. So I feel that networking and philanthropy is a big part of that conversation.
Wonderful. So Cedric's pointing out, ironically, today's National Philanthropy Day. So thanks for letting us know.
I didn't know that.
Just to welcome a few more people: Wagdaras from Ethiopia, Badamasi from Nigeria, Oscar from, I think, Chile, Ifiani from Nigeria. Please keep letting us know where you're watching from. And I'll just make one comment, then we have questions starting to come in, and please keep letting us know where you're watching from. So a friend of mine runs recruitment for Ashoka Bob Sport, and he's a very like future oriented collaborative person. And one of the things, it's not just his idea, but like the future of social change is like collaborative networks that are, sometimes they're permanent, but a lot of times they're just kind of coalescing, and we need network weavers or conveners to bring them together, because otherwise it won't happen. And so the future of change is really bringing together diverse sectors through network weavers to collaborate on both local and global challenges. And that so much of what we're taught is sectoral based or based on particular funders or donors. But it's when I talk to engineers, like I was at a engineering event a few years ago in The Hague, and like I know nothing about engineering, but it was like, I was invited like as a peace builder. But like the more I talk to people outside of my little narrow, however I define my sector, that's when the real rich conversations happen, and those kind of both spontaneous and structured collaboration. So, and then also for philanthropy, Edgar Villanueva, his book and work on decolonizing wealth is, I think it just came out the second edition, but he's Native American and worked in philanthropy and still is, but is trying to challenge so much of where philanthropy's resources come from, not exclusively, often is extractive in nature. And, now they're celebrated, like, whether it's Rockefeller or Carnegie or, other philanthropists, a lot of that wealth is not often generated through the most equitable means. And so he's both asking, and his team, and just look up decolonizing philanthropy or decolonizing wealth, but their team is asking a lot of questions like, how do we change power dynamics? Like, it's not just a program officer or a board sitting remotely removed saying you have to fill out these 50-page proposals. Like there are efforts to change the whole nature of what philanthropy is and the power dynamics, but that's a hard thing. Justin, welcome from Canada. So Alexandra, again, based in Ecuador, has a question. In terms of working with Indigenous communities, what would you say are the most important skills, tools, considerations in order to be an ally and have productive partnerships?
That's a great question. So when I first embarked in this journey, I really did think that my diplomas was going to matter. But, nobody cared what the name of my master's program was or anything like that. What they really cared was what I could contribute. And that contribution is not something that you do right away, because you do need to spend time and work with communities, right, to get to the point where there is a concrete contribution as an ally. And indeed, in order to get there, a relationship has to be made, and that relationship can, in my case, I was fortunate that I was introduced to my Mapuche colleagues through my partner, who was already in contact with them. And he also has an activist background. So he's very well versed in the Mapuche history and the Mapuche cause. So I learned very quickly through him, but also in my case, I also picked up on other forms of contribution that he couldn't, and one of them mainly being that I was a woman. So in that case, there are certain, I guess, needs that need to be made in order for relationships to be established, relationships of trust, right? And that requires time and the acknowledgement that the communities always have the last say in everything. And that puts you at risk, of course, because, if one day they decide to, not work with you anymore, and you have contributed so much of your time and energy, you can't just fight for that. You have to leave, right? Because it's a work around informed consent and decision-making protocols where communities have the last say when working with allies and researchers and collaborations and organizations, etc. So keeping that in mind does give you the need to kind of be vulnerable, I guess, especially in the beginning. And I think that that's relevant. I think you do have to show some vulnerability in the beginning. And I think another part of the concept, what I mentioned, I threw in there the women's situation, is that indeed, I think the main contribution in the beginning, in my first, 3 months, because we lived in the community for about a year, was my famous, my mom's Paraguayan tortilla recipes. So that was needed. That was part of the relationship building and the being able to share. I didn't make it as good as my mom, obviously, but at least I tried, and at least I was able to provide something of myself and be able to host. I think that was a relevant contribution in that part of the story. But in terms of the concrete, more the later times, in order to answer your question more specifically, is the need to first observe and learn and listen, and being able to, as an outsider, being able to systematize that and contribute back into a tool that addresses the priorities of the community. And that kind of...
Apology, I think we lost Alison for a minute, so hopefully she will be back. She had a little bit of internet challenges this morning, so while we're waiting, and she might have to pop out and come back in, but while we're waiting, please let us know what questions you might have. Let us know where you're chatting from, and again, when we put together the podcast episode of this, we'll edit out this kind of interruption. And just while we're waiting for Alison to come back, a few updates. So please, again, as we started off, let us know where you're watching from, your questions, your comments. Feel free to put in a sentence or two about your background. Please check out the Social Change Career podcast. Again, almost 120 episodes with brilliant innovators from all over the world. And we deeply appreciate, particularly if you help us grow our reach by rating the podcast on your favorite podcasting platform and or sharing it in your networks. We have lots of great episodes coming up. Since this is an evergreen episode, the idea of this content is relevant for the foreseeable future. For the long term, I don't want to get too much into the episodes, but we did mention Barbara Moser-Mercer is coming up, one of the world's experts on working on increasing access to higher education for displaced populations. So that will be the end of November. And then just a couple of other things for people who do not know PCDN. You can go to our website, pcdn.global, and sign up for our free weekly newsletter, which we curate the world's best impact opportunities. And then we also do lots of other things. And in particular, one thing we're particularly excited about, Alison's coming back in. So yes. Alison, we're bringing you back in just 1 second. Sure. We're pretty excited about our course, AI for Social Impact. So I just did a little filler speech, and I told everyone, we'll edit this out in the actual podcast episode. Can you hear me okay? Is there any background noise?
I can, yes. I did log in through my phone for some reason. But yeah, I'm good.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So if you want to finish up, you were just talking, to Alexandra's question. Thank you for coming back. Talking a little bit about kind of one is your mother's Paraguayan tortilla recipe, which maybe you'll share it with us all. And I'll just make a comment that honestly, I think we're going to have an expert on food and kind of food and culture. I think in January, I won't get into too many specifics, but I have consistently seen there's something about food. Sometimes, I don't drink alcohol, but sometimes alcohol up to a certain limit. But there's something about the ability to create spaces where people interact outside of the formal, let's get something done. Because so many people come in we're going to do a project or we have to write this proposal, but so many cultures are about relationships. And when I've come in oh, we got to do this and that, it's, versus just this collaborative learning and spending tons of hours, like not getting to business, but getting to relationships. It's such a different experience. So if you want to continue with your answer.
Sure. Yeah. I think that what you just said was really clear. Hit the nail on the head, Craig, because I think living in the community really helped to create those relationships. So that's just one example. That tortilla story is just one example of how we were able to create relationships, and we were more able to do so by being invited to live there. But I was going to say from the more technical standpoint, and it's this transformation of being the listener, observer, and transforming what you're hearing and what you're observing and what you're learning, transform that into or systematize that as a technical contributor, basically as an ally, into tools that the communities can use for themselves towards a cause that they are linking themselves to. So so in our case, for example, we were able to observe and learn first through some methodologies that we had used around research, so qualitative, quantitative kind of approaches to learning about the communities in a participatory way. We actually had two community women join our research team, and that way we can exchange knowledge, us from the researcher perspective, and then them from their the protocol perspective and the cultural dynamics perspective. So we were able to do that, and then from after the research phase, we had co-designed a savings mechanism, and we began piloting it, and that in itself required some technical tools that Maple uses, Maple Microdevelopment, which is linked to savings and loans groups, for example. So how do you organize community assets? What is considered an asset? Is it just monetary, or is it also non-monetary? So we brought in the need to incorporate non-monetary assets. What does that mean? What does it mean when you exchange, cash for a chicken? So things like that were tools that our team could contribute in order for there to be a concrete a piloting of this community-led savings groups, which is basically the first project that we co-designed with the communities back in 2013, 2014. But yeah, I'm going to stress tools. I think that's relevant, because sometimes we get carried away that perhaps as an ally, I guess maybe it's not about us. I guess maybe to emphasize that it's about providing the tools so that the communities themselves can lead the next steps.
Wonderful. So welcome, Philip from Nairobi, and Ifeanyi, just go to PCDN.global. So just make one comment, and please keep the questions coming. So I've lived in lots of countries. I've been in Colombia for almost 6 years. Obviously, my wife and partner, she's Colombian, and I've been coming for 20 years, but I'm an outsider. And my first trip to Colombia was 2001, and Catalina took me to a meeting, like a national meeting of peace builders, like one of the main networks. And my Spanish was non-existent then. But I remember thinking even back then, like, they don't need more training around peace building. Like so many of the places I've been in the world, like and not locals don't have all the answers either. So I don't want to say like everything should be local, but so many times, like, people have the most amazing capacity, skills. And often where I found like allies or outsiders or ecosystems is like they can provide access to funding, information, opportunity, amplification, and reflection. Because often people don't even realize, and connecting them. So someone from Colombia connecting to someone from Ecuador or Bosnia, like, so often, but so much of the development sector is focused on not that happening. It's changing. So anyway, I'm not sure where it's going with that thought, but it made me think of that. So a question for you: can you talk about an example of 2 or 3 projects where either you and the community, or you and your partner, have felt like, since you've been there, not that it has to be the biggest impact, but something that where you've seen some strong change, either in culture, economic, equality, opportunity, education. So what are some examples of projects or efforts where you can say, not that you've led it, but you've been part of it, you've seen like something, a problem's been defined and some kind of community-led partnership intervention's been carried out and a change has resulted that, genuinely has been positive?
Yeah, okay. I guess I'll talk, I guess, from three kind of angles. The first is the basically around community assets. The second would be from the perspective of women-led initiatives, and the third would be indigenous-led restoration and conservation. I guess I'll just talk about it from those three. But yeah, I think the first one, and I'm speaking more from the chronological order, I guess this is how I frame it in my mind, is that when we began this work, communities believed that they weren't saving. I mean, what is cash? It disappears right away. So we were given the insight, or at least the initial conversations, it seemed that they believed that they weren't saving. And when we began these conversations and dialogues, we quickly realized that yes, they were saving, but maybe not in monetary mechanisms, but in non-monetary. So, saving in chickens, in cows, in seeds was all part of a savings mechanism that involved long-term planning. But indeed, because of the intense, the conventional agriculture that was imposed on them decades ago, their way of life involved, in the terms of the cash, the way that the cash was received was mostly by selling potatoes to intermediaries at a very unstable price, and then those intermediaries would be selling it at 3 times the value in the main cities, etc. So that was the beginning of our journey in understanding what community assets meant from both the monetary but also the non-monetary perspective. And so when this what they wanted, and this was considered, that's why they invited us to participate, was called a Mapuche bank, but it quickly grew to not really being a bank and not being a savings and loans, but to what they call in their own language Keyuwun, which means mutual support. So what began as an asset building kind of conception in their minds led to a mutual support group, which today consists in 40 members. So what's happening through that process is that, and answering your question, Craig, about the impact, is that because we were able to co-design a mechanism where people can save together both in monetary and non-monetary, so meaning people can deposit 50,000 Chilean pesos, and another person can deposit a chicken. I think the way that we co-designed this mutual support group enabled those who don't have monetary assets to be able to take out a loan from this community savings pool that involved monetary, non-monetary. And I don't mean it in a loan the way that you would think of the bank, but basically a support, so that way they don't have to sell their chicken if all they're looking for is a transport to the city. Because that's what happened before, is that just because someone needed to send their kids to the doctor in a couple of hour bus ride and they didn't have cash, they would sell their chicken, and the chicken was actually much more valuable than the amount that they sold it for. So things like that emerge in some of these impacts. In one case, for example, there was an elderly man who needed to have an operation at the hospital, and he didn't have the funds. and the members all decided to pull in their savings and provide the support to this family so that he can have his operation. So these things like that. So basically this fund that is called now the Mutual Support Group runs on an agricultural annual cycle. So it's not from January to February, but from summer to spring. I mean, it's by by season, because through the seasons, that's when the families increment have more savings and less savings. So it fluctuates throughout the year. It's not just one consistent linear concept of savings. And this is because of the idea of creating a mutual support group that involves both monetary and non-monetary. So that's one of them. So being able to save more, being able to save their community and non-monetary assets for the long term. The second is women-led initiatives. I think that these kind of projects are emerging all over the world because we're quickly learning that knowledge and the sense of responsibility is very much tied to the woman and their family. And I'm not saying that the males in the household don't have that, but in places where nuclear families are still intact, like where we are in the communities where we work with, indeed the male role is different. They are the breadwinners, or not breadwinners, but they are working more in the field. They're the ones working in agriculture. So the women, on the other hand, they're tending more to their gardens, raising sheep if they have any, or raising any other animals near the home. So those kind of things were kind of configured into our conversations with them, because what happened, or what we learned, is that the women are in need of wanting to revitalize their indigenous heritage and their indigenous ways of being and knowing. And so from there, women's association emerged, where they began to revitalize the sheep, the wool, but most importantly and most recently, actually, I'm in the middle of this, is revitalizing livelihoods based on wetland, because it's all in a wetland. It's a coastal wetland. Lake Buli, this is where we work, is in a coastal wetland area, and so they're revitalizing wetland fibers that their ancestors used to make back in the day, and for use, basically useful tools or useful household items. That was later replaced by plastic and all the cheap things imported, basically. But so they're in the middle of revitalizing that and strengthening that knowledge and that practice. And then finally, the third is the indigenous-led conservation, which has been something that we've been dedicated since 2000. Over the last 3 or 4 years, it's emerged as a priority from the communities. And in that case, they're in the middle of, strengthening not only custodians that hold this traditional knowledge, but also working with the youth to become monitors and observers of their land and their environment. So they're kind of like indigenous-led researchers in a way, or community monitors, environmental monitors. I wanted to say that in this specific context, when we think of indigenous communities, we think of lands that are still intact in many cases, right? And that is very relevant. But indeed, the places, the communities that we work with are in areas where their lands have been fragmented and deforested, and so there is the need to revitalize. And so this concept of restoration is actually a new concept within this indigenous context, because indigenous peoples didn't, the concept of restoring lands that were destroyed by colonization or development, etc., is growing from it. There's a need to address the rights issue and the advocacy issue around that, but there's also the need to address what it means to restore it. So that's the process that we're in today with the communities. I don't know if I answered your question, Craig. I feel like I was a little bit all over the place, but yeah.
No, I think you helped ground it very well in 3 different examples about around the Mapuche Bank and the conservation and women's association. I think it helps make it very grounded. So we have about 10 minutes left if anybody wants to put in questions. So one question, when people come to you, because I'm sure this happens, whether it's someone from South America or the US, and they say they want to work on something related to impact, whether it's support, whether they're Indigenous or an ally, or they want to work in sustainability, how do you advise people to figure out like what's the right next step? I mean, not talking about a career, but like what's the right next step to figure out like how their skills match actually the job market, or how to figure out even if they're interested in 100 things. Like when people come to you and say, like, what do you think? I'm interested in everything. Like, how do you advise people to think about either finding some focus or find the right match, or where to begin?
I think that researching ideal organizations that you would like to work with is a good next step. I mean, I understand that when young people are recently graduated are wanting to start their career, sometimes you just set the net wide and see what happens, which I did when I first graduated. So yeah, I understand that part. But I do also think that we are in a period right now where, and this is my own personal opinion, but I do feel that the more resources or the more privileged you are, the more responsibility you hold. I mean, I think that we can't put all of the responsibility on indigenous territories, for example, or marginalized communities, or, I mean, they can't do the fight on their own, basically, is kind of what I'm saying. So I would suggest that you understand what kind of groups you're interested in working with, who are in line with your cause and you're in line with your vision of who you want to be in the future. I think that that's also important to have a intentionality. So it's one thing to go with the flow, and that's great, but at the same time, it's also good to have some kind of vision, an intention, and maybe finding mentors that would help. But even if you don't find a mentor, I think it's also good to imagine yourself as your own mentor of who you would like to be in 10 or 15 years and how you would like to contribute. So yeah, just to answer simply, I would definitely research what's out there in terms of the groups and organizations. A lot of good groups are out there. A lot of international organizations are out there doing really good work, and some of them are not as well known as others. So that's why it's important that you know who they are, and at the same time they're getting support. I mean, as I mentioned earlier with philanthropy is also growing and evolving, and there's a lot of funders and groups out there that are wanting to support groups that are really doing good work, and that's shifting today. I mean, I think that and this is just the beginning, I feel. So yeah.
So 2 or 3 follow-up kind of ending questions. So one is, I was just looking up as you're talking, the international funders for Indigenous peoples is like a network of foundations that are supporting Indigenous rights, conservation, economics. When you think of where do you find community? I mean, obviously in Chile, but outside, like when you're thinking about sharing what works for you and also your frustrations, and you're trying to learn from other. I mean, my wife is on a board here. We have friends who set up a foundation, works with displaced. Colombia is about 5% Indigenous. So, I mean, and there's all different groups. There's the Kogis that are world famous, in the Sierra Nevadas, and then Embera. There's lots of different Embera groups, but a lot have been displaced because of violence, and a lot come to Medellin. So some friends started it, and they're allies. They started an organization, and they're doing a lot using their, let's say, Indigenous art, let's say art and design, and like having people design products, but then they export them to the US and sell them at a higher value. And then all the money goes back to like health and education. And so it's really interesting. But where do you go both to like learn about, oh my gosh, they're doing this in Brazil, or Indonesia. Like, so where do you find inspiration, ideas, and community? Like, is there any networks or publications or conferences like where you kind of go beyond what's happening in Chile?
Yeah. So I'm currently a member of the Community Economies Institute. So they're trying to push the role of the researcher, and I've learned a lot from them and what it means to what is community economies from the perspective of diverse economies, that we want to bring to light. So that there's that group that was founded by professors in Australia. So that's one. The second is there's a group called the Ecological Economics Society. I just recently got involved, and I thought there was some interesting conversations there happening. Actually, I was in Santa Marta, Colombia, a couple of weeks ago. We were in a conference discussing the role of economics and environment, and how basically the economists are just doing a really bad job. Like, we need new economists because the current economy, anyways. So that was a really great conference. And then, as a small update, I am linked to, as a donor relations coordinator, I am linked to Cultural Survival. So they are a really great group that is working on Indigenous rights, and working directly with communities to really understand what it means to foster Indigenous-led solutions on the ground. So I'm really honored to be part of their team, led by Galina. So yeah, I think those are where I find, in that sense, inspiration and people to talk to and talk about these things. Yeah.
Yeah, I was a lowly research assistant at the U.S. Institute of Peace when David Mayberry Lewis was a senior fellow. He was one of the founders of Cultural Survival. So, and they've been doing, I think, 4 decades, 5 decades, amazing work all over the world. So, 2 final questions. So, one is, we always ask people, when is there a book, a podcast, a television series, or let's say streaming series, doesn't have anything to do with work, but that you're just enjoying, that kind of could be purely fiction or crime podcast, but something you're enjoying that has nothing to do with work, that that you might say, hey, this is either fun or interesting or deep, that others might take a look at.
Oh, for others to take a look at? Oh, okay.
Yeah, like something you're doing, like something not non-work related, that you're either reading, watching, listening to, that just kind of is either fun or deep, that you might say, hey, others might find this interesting.
Okay. Well, okay, so this is going to be maybe slightly embarrassing, but I have been watching Korean drama on Netflix. Like, in the evening, I do kind of, and I just really love watching them eat. I just love how all the dishes, and how food is such a big part of all of the drama. So I really enjoy it. And then, of course, there's always books that I'm reading. At the moment, I am reading a history on the book on the origins of Sephardic history from the Al-Andalus region. So I am interested. I have been reading a book on that, and also with what's going on in the Middle East, it's also kind of being linked to history somehow helps me to process stuff too. So and current conflict. Understanding history, it helps you process conflict, I guess. So yeah, I think that I can say those 2 for now. Craig, I have a bunch, but I think I guess this is good. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I watch some Korean dramas. Kathy and I have been addicted to Bollywood forever. And there's a lot of dumb Bollywood, but actually there's a lot of really, and particularly I think because of Netflix and Amazon's investment, like there's a lot of good Bollywood movies, but there's a lot of series now that are not just people dancing and singing, but there's actually really interesting social commentary. So what can people do to help your work? Obviously, if anybody has a check they want to write, but like in terms of Maple micro development, is it just subscribe to your newsletter, or like what kind of what kind of things would help you do your work? I mean, obviously money is one thing, but what else?
Yeah, I mean, so Maple's is a small nonprofit. We have networks in Uganda, in Oregon, and here in Chile, which is just me and my partner. But basically, our website has been our website has some of our updates, not all of it. So what we do is provide field updates every once in a while. And so if people are interested to learn more, either they can connect with me on LinkedIn or send me an email, and I can add you to our field updates. We're working on getting a newsletter out soon, so it's still on the works. But meanwhile, I would just love to get in touch with anybody who's listening to this and start a conversation, and if you're further interested in learning more about our work, I can connect you with whatever programs or people you're interested in connecting with, or just in general being linked to our organization through these newsletters. But yeah, I think the first step, Craig, would be to reach me personally. I think that if that would work for people through LinkedIn or through my email. But of course, I also check the info@maplemicro.org email on Maple's website. So that's definitely a place where people can send me something as well. And that's info at Maple Micro, so MAPLEMICRO.org. And I'll be happy to keep the conversation. Yeah.
Okay. And then just last question. I mean, in Colombia, indigenous peoples, I mean, that we had a really good constitution passed in 91 that gave a lot more kind of legal rights and, guarantees. Obviously, there's the difference between the law and implementation. And Colombia still has a lot of violence, and it tends to more disproportionately affect, obviously, human rights activists, labor activists, union organizers, but also Afro-Colombians and indigenous. I mean, it can affect anybody, but so how do you stay up? How do you maintain your own sanity? Just whether you're thinking about Chile or the state of the world, any tips for others? Because these are big issues, even if you're working in one, couple of communities. So just any tips for others thinking whether they're working at the local level or big level, these are huge challenges, and just your thoughts for maintaining your own well-being.
Yeah, I mean, because I live far away from my family and I don't have family here, my nuclear family, definitely family. I've said that 5 times, I guess, in the last 5 seconds, but family definitely keeps me grounded and reminds me of being loved. So, yeah.
Okay, very cool. So thank you so much for sharing your energy, wisdom, questions, and lessons. And everyone, thank you for joining us. Apologies for the 2-minute interruption, but again, that'll be edited out in the podcast, which should be live Friday. Thank you. We had a lot of people joining us from East and West Africa, but thank you also for Andean region, Europe, and I don't think we had anyone from Asia today. Please follow Alison on LinkedIn, look up Maple Micro Development, follow PCDN on LinkedIn. You can subscribe to our newsletter if you go to pcdn.global. And as we started off, the one ask, apart from just following, is share and rate this episode and other ones in the podcast. So thank you, Alison, for everything you help to do to serve others and make impact.
Thank you so much, Craig. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so we're going to end here, and thank you, everyone, for watching. I'm just shutting it.